The subject of ethics is a critical issue when it comes to modern science. Despite this, most modern scientists actually receive virtually no training in ethics. This is one of the dilemmas of modern society. So what we're going to do through this next section is try to delve into some of the considerations that ethnobotanists have in the area of ethics. This crosses both the research that ethnobotanists do, the kinds of ways that ethnobotanists relate to other scientists, and most critically, the ways in which ethnobotanists deal with the people from whom we're learning information and how we treat that information. There's a large range of ethical issues to be concerned with, and we're going to try to deal with a little bit of this spectrum. For most scientists today, the question of ethics is something that they may have never thought about. However, ethical issues affect all of us, and being able to make decisions following a set of ethical guidelines are really essential for most modern people. These guide decision processes throughout daily life, and they also guide the decisions that professionals such as ethnobotanists need to make in their work. Throughout the balance of this presentation, we'll be discussing the role of ethics in science and ethical behavior.
Ethical standards are found in all cultures. Some people might not think about this. All individuals, including each of you, have a set of core values that are used to make moral and ethical decisions. Collectively, shared ethics form the basis of a culture or a community. And in fact, some people would argue that it is the shared ethos that actually defines what a culture is. Individuals without consistent ethical standards are usually not accepted into a culture and are socially dysfunctional. And in fact, this is one of the potential definitions of a social deviant, is somebody who doesn't carry the same ethical standards as other people, or has a set of standards that seem to jump around and don't really produce any consistency. It's really a false idea that scientists have no ethics. The basis for this is kind of a weird assumption that if scientists are actually impartial observers, then the role of ethics will not come into play in the work that they do. And this is really a misconception. Rather, determination of individual scientific and personal values and standards is actually essential to conducting effective research studies. And this is not just true in ethnobotany, this is actually true in any science. Because at its heart, science, by definition, is a search for truth. And if you don't have a set of standards by which you approach what you think to be the truth, then you have no standards upon which to measure whatever it is you're looking at, to evaluate it, and to place it within a context. And so ethics are actually a very important thing to scientists. Much of this particular episode deals with the ethics of conducting research in other cultures. And that's largely because much of the orientation of ethnobotanists has in the past been towards other cultures. However, it's just as important to follow ethical guidelines when working and living in your own culture. And increasingly, more and more ethnobotanists are actually trying to analyze what the kinds of interactions are that people have with plants within their own culture. And so the study of ethics within your own culture is of increasing importance. So one of the interesting aspects is that ethical dilemmas happen to be at the heart of questions in ethics. Dilemmas are kinds of problems that occur due to personal actions or inactions. And the fact that it can be both an action that occurs or an inaction, meaning something that you just avoid doing or fail to do, is really important. These kinds of problems strike at the heart of who we are and who someone else is. And it's this combination of ourselves and what we stand for and other people and what they stand for that oftentimes sets up what we call an ethical dilemma, where there's a conflict. Though a question that's kind of an important one is, why would we cover ethics in an introductory study of ethnobotany? Isn't this something that's really important for a higher level of discourse? And the answer to this is pretty straightforward. There's an awful lot of people who go to a university and learn about one science or another, develop a whole range of skills and learn lots of little factoids, who actually never take a course that deals with ethics at all. And yet it's very clear that being able to make ethical decisions is really important in our society, particularly as we increasingly live in a pluralistic society where we have people from different worldviews living and working side by side. So increasingly ethics must be taught, and so we have chosen to insert it within each of our courses as a standard element, and so here we have it. What's really worse, I think, than the fact that many people come and go is that there's an awful lot of people who go through a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, and a PhD, and they become a scientist and maybe even a leader in their field, and they've never been given the opportunity to even think about ethics or be concerned with it until the day that they make a major boo-boo and really screw something up, and then suddenly here it is in their face. Whereas probably if they had had the opportunity to think through things, this might have affected the way they made some decisions in their lives, and they wouldn't find themselves, sitting in some white-collar prison because of something stupid, or simply being ostracized by the scientific community for making a fatal error. And probably the most important reason why ethics is being discussed in ethnobotany is that ethnobotanists deal with ethical issues every time they conduct research. And so part of knowing the topic of ethnobotany is really knowing about ethics, because it's part and parcel of what this discipline does. We interact with people. And when you interact with people, particularly crossing from one culture to another, you're going to run into ethical dilemmas. There's a kind of a common statement that people who are kind of loudmouths like me kind of hear a little too often, and the statement is this: you always think you're right, don't you? Well, let's kind of analyze that for just a second. Let's assume that you're a rational person, and somebody shows you pretty definitively that something that you believed is not correct. What you're most likely going to do is change what you think and probably shift to whatever it was the person convinced you of, because that's the whole point. They convinced you. And so you shift to that idea. And now that's what you think is right. And presumably we go through our whole lives learning things from when we're young children, and we think that what we're learning is true. And then at some point, somebody teaches us something that changes our minds, and so we change to the new idea. The key point in all of this is that a rational person is going to change constantly to what they think is right. And therefore, only a complete idiot would not always think that they were right. So the statement, you always think you're right, is pretty obvious. It's a statement of something that just makes too much sense. And so the person who doesn't think they're right is really pretty dumb. And so anybody who can't be accused of this statement really has a problem. And you might say, well, what does this have to do with ethics? Well, it has a lot to do with ethics, because the simple fact of the matter is that every human on earth who's a rational thinking person always thinks they're right. And that's part of the point. Everybody thinks they're right, and yet not everybody thinks exactly the same thing. So the implication of this is that either there's multiple ways to be right, or there's multiple ways to be wrong, or some combination of the two. So let's take this a little bit further. Within the discussion of ethics, and actually kind of within modern society, we have a set of ideas that are oftentimes referred to as modernity or modernity of beliefs. And these, I would contend, contain several big mistakes. The first of these is there's a misunderstanding of the concept of tolerance. So in one way, we can understand tolerance as understanding of other people and being willing to recognize that there's a plurality of beliefs around you, and that other people don't necessarily think the same way as you, and that's okay. And that's probably a pretty safe way to think about tolerance. On the other hand, there's a tolerance that doesn't just recognize that there's a variety of beliefs around you, but actually tries to, for some strange reason, accept all beliefs that are around you. It turns out that this is really quite irrational. We have quite a number of New Age movements that are clearly evolved out of individuals thinking that they can accept all beliefs around them, even beliefs that are clearly in direct conflict with each other. And so this brand of tolerance has some severe problems, logically if not practically. Another is the idea that there don't have to be common values. And yet it's very clear that in traditional cultures around the world that people who hold common values do so in part because it's the way they've grown up and they don't necessarily know of another option, but also in part because by holding values in common with other members of the community, you have a sense of belonging to that community. You know what to expect out of other people, they know what to expect out of you, and it creates a functional social unit. And obviously culture is largely developed as a means for people to get along with each other and have functional social units. So having common values clearly is an important thing for groups of people to work together and live together. The third big mistake that we see is the idea of relativism. And this is a rather strange twist because we take ideas out of physics and the relativity of events that occur from different perspectives on the universe and kind of twist this around with moral and other philosophical positions and somehow come out with the contorted view that there are no absolutes and there are no truth. Well, anybody who's a scientist, and I would like to think that I'm a scientist, cannot hold a relativistic perspective on the issue of truth. There actually must be truth. Otherwise, science is a complete waste of time. Now, it's certainly possible for people to just completely discount science and say, yeah, it doesn't matter, and so science as a search for truth is kind of a waste of time, everything is relative. That's a difficult position to argue with because you could also argue that that position itself is relative, and therefore there is an absolute, but it's all part of the relativistic problem. Hopefully you can see the weird, twisted problems that occur here where you actually cannot come out with a logical conclusion once you start down this slippery slope. One of the things that this brings to bear is a pairing of beliefs. One of these is the idea that all individuals should have their beliefs, but that they should keep them private, that these should be left at home and they should never come out into the public arena. However, fundamentally, this is also a logical problem because the idea that beliefs should be left at home and not come into the public arena is itself a position that is taken and a belief that is held. And so anybody who brings that perspective into the public arena obviously hasn't left it at home. So you're left with another one of these logical quagmires that once you start down it, you rapidly fall into an abyss and you have no hope of finding, something firm to stand on. So the idea that belief should be private and left at home doesn't make any rational sense. And yet we have an awful lot of people on college campuses who kind of hold this up and wave this flag around as if it's something, that's important. Frankly, they're a bunch of loons. So, the final issue in this that it kind of relates to all of these is the idea that, it's what's right for you is right for you, and what's right for me is right for me, and you do your thing, I'll do mine. And this all kind of looks good on paper, and it seems to be consistent with a fair idea of tolerance. However, this is also part of a slippery slope that you kind of have to think about to come to a conclusion with. So let's say for just a moment that we accept this as truth. Now let's say that I reached into an audience of 200 people, and I picked out one of them, and I brought them to the front of the room, and I pulled out a rather large and nasty looking knife, and I held it to the person's throat, and I announced that I was going to slit their throat and watch them bleed to death. Now, if we all held the belief that you do your thing and I'll do mine, then nobody in the audience should object to this issue. Now, the person with the knife at their throat might object mightily, because it's very clear that while I'm doing my thing, the thing that they get to do is not what they probably wanted. But in a rational society, the idea of you do your thing and I will do mine actually does not uphold. And this is actually why we have law. Laws come in and say, hey, you can do a lot of your things, but there's a few things that you might want to do that, we've all decided as a group you can't do. And, obviously not all cultures have the same sets of laws, but I don't know of any culture that's a complete free-for-all and says, you can do anything you want. So in this example, I think I'd have to put the knife away and apologize to the person and, say, all right, I guess I can't do my thing whenever I want to. So, I can't be this bloody, cold-minded killer. I have to go back to being a scientist. So, what this brings us to is the simple idea that opposed to the issue of modernity of beliefs is a more rational approach, and actually, I dare say, a more common human cultural approach, which is the idea that any community of people has a set of shared beliefs and behaviors and a sense of belonging to a group, and that these serve as the fundamental basis of culture. So, if we are cultural individuals, it means that we do have a set of beliefs, we have a set of behaviors, and a sense of belonging to some group. Now, it doesn't mean that we have a set of shared beliefs with everybody we encounter, nor a set of shared behaviors with everybody, nor a sense of common belonging to everybody we meet. But we do have it with somebody, some group of people, and that is our culture. And all of this exactly points out that the idea of modernity is a complete joke, and frankly, any decent scientist should discard this line of thinking. It seems to hold up well in some philosophy camps and within some groups of society, but it doesn't actually hold water in the real world. Okay, well, before I get back to ethics, I have to hammer on modernity for just a moment further, and there's a reason why I do this, and the reason is because at least from my observation as a scientist who's trying to be an impartial observer, what I see is that this concept of modernity, although it would at first appear to be a functional one and a rule of tolerance that should be helping people to be able to get along with each other, in fact, what it's actually doing is leading to erosion of a lot of cultural values. And it's setting up a situation where people who grow up in a particular culture feel like they must abandon their culture in order to embrace some kind of generic nothingness. And I really worry about this because I think that cultural diversity is a very important thing, and that as ethnobotanists, clearly we are very interested in both conservation of biological diversity, the plants, and in conservation of cultural diversity, and that modernity of beliefs actually is an attack on traditional cultural values, beliefs, and interactions with plants. And the way that it attacks it is that modernity of beliefs causes an alienation of individuals as they have to shift from a traditional way of thinking where they have a group on which they can depend to a very, very individualized way of looking at the world, where people are expected to act as individuals and not as groups, and think only of themselves and not think of other people. And this is a lot of the problem. The diagram that you see illustrated here kind of shows a set of breaks that happen. So if you consider that traditional cultures and ethics depend upon a set of shared beliefs, of belonging to a group, and of shared behaviors, you can see that relativism, pluralism, and privatization are all aspects that serve to break the linkages between the elements of a traditional ethos. Peterson in 1996 said this when he was discussing the idea of modernization of the mind. He said, "Modernity is a mindset. It's a way of thinking. It is a way of thinking that eventually alienates. It cuts us adrift as a society, and on the individual level, life becomes an aimless wandering. Through modernity, our beliefs become so tentative that they are not strong enough to bind us to others in community. We lose our capacity to belong. Because we don't belong, we have no accountability for our behavior. Our beliefs aren't strong enough to influence behavior either, so behavior pretty much goes out of control. People who live this way get hurt." And I would further speculate that people who live this way functionally lose their ability to not only function within their own culture, but to be able to deal with and understand other cultures that still hold their beliefs, behaviors, and sense of belonging. And therefore, in order to be a functional ethnobotanist, it is absolutely essential that as a scientist, you develop a clear understanding of what your own beliefs are, what the shared behaviors are that you have with people you consider as part of your culture, and what those elements are that contribute to your belonging to a community. If you can't do that for your own culture, I'm pretty confident you won't be able to do it functionally when you're trying to understand another culture. All right, so let's get back to ethical values here. When we consider ethics, we really have two major categories that we're interested in. The first is your personal philosophies and standards that you hold as an individual and that I hold as an individual. So each of us has a set of personal philosophies and standards that we uphold and live by. Likewise, there's a set of group philosophies and standards that we use to interact with people around us. Now, when we're dealing within a group of people that we feel are our own culture and that we identify with, it's likely that the personal philosophies and the group philosophies will, for the most part, be the same thing. As you interact with people in a group that you are more and more distant from, that you identify with less and less, you'll start to see differences between your personal philosophies and those of the group you're interacting with. So within a group, we have a set of kind of categories that you can think of as kind of increasing zones of distance from yourself out into the group. So the first is probably your peer group. It's people you hang out with. It could be your family, fellow students, researchers, etc. It depends on, kind of what your social group is that you hang out with. As a scientist, the next group out is really my colleagues. This could be teachers. It could be others whom I learn from but are not part of my family. They're not part of that inner group. Then I have the local culture. It's the community that's around me. It could be the community where I go to do my research, but it's a smaller level community. I have local leaders. This could be people who are further out. They may or may not represent the same views as the local culture, but they probably represent some kind of government authority, or in many cases they represent some kind of a religious authority. In either case, they represent a zone that's around you that's a little further out there. Next, we could go up to the level of a national government, where you have the philosophies of a government, and so this has to take into account a wide range of perspectives of people who live within that country, and so therefore it's likely to be more diverse and more inclusive than that of the small group. And then finally, a special aspect that we have to think about as scientists is that as scientists we usually have some institutions that we either work for or are sponsoring us, and it's really important that we don't bite the hand that feeds us. And so we need to recognize that if the National Science Foundation funds my research, the National Science Foundation has a set of ethical values that it stands on, and I need to make sure that I'm not stomping on those values. Likewise, I happen to be an instructor at the University of Hawaii, and the University of Hawaii has a set of ethical values and standards that it upholds, and I need to make sure that I'm honoring those and not stomping on those. When we're considering personal philosophies and standards, probably the most important thing to consider is the idea of core values. Each of us have some core values, and you can think of core values as being those beliefs or behaviors that you have that no matter what the circumstances are, you would not violate them. Or if you did violate them, you would feel really, really bad about it. And to the point that this would be a psychological problem. So what might a core value be? Well, core values actually are not the same for every person. So let me kind of give an example, and then you can think through what your core values are. And it's a really good exercise to try to think through exactly what your own are. So here's an example. My wife does not believe in drinking alcohol. For her, drinking alcohol is a core value. She just will not do it. She just doesn't want to do it. For me, drinking alcohol is not a core value. I don't have a problem drinking it. I kind of like it, in fact. However, for me, I don't like to get drunk. And so for me, getting drunk is a core value. Now, I have friends who have absolutely no problem getting drunk. And so for them, their core value is something different. And in fact, it may not even be on this particular scale. All of us have things that we're willing to do, and we have things that we are completely unwilling to do. And it turns out that the actual core values is a fairly small number of things for most people. We have lots of things that we prefer. For instance, there's a lot of people that prefer to be vegetarians. But when push comes to shove, they're not opposed to eating meat. However, there are some people who are true vegetarians, and they just will not eat meat, and in fact, they would rather starve than eat it. So for them, that really is a core value. Whereas for many people, it's not a core value, it's just kind of a preference. And so all of us have lots of preferences, but we generally have very few core values. Now, when we're conducting research, one of the things that's really important is that we try to determine what our core values are, and try not to violate those. So if I'm working in a community and I realize that in that community there's something that typically happens that might violate my core values, it's important that I discuss this with some of the people there before I get into the situation where I might be faced with the choice. Because sometimes in that situation, it's kind of too late to change your mind. And so, as a good research practice, we try to think through potential problems where our personal core values would be violated within a particular culture, and we try to either avoid those situations where that might happen, or make sure that the people that we're working with understand our values. And remember, they have their own values, and I have yet to work in a culture where people didn't. And because people have their own values, it's pretty easy for them to understand that you have values, even though yours may be a little different. And actually there's some interesting conversations that come out of people comparing core values across cultures. And people are sometimes surprised to learn that outside scientists have a set of values that are somewhat similar to their own, but are also somewhat different. The second set of issues that we have to deal with deals with considering the standards of other people. So it's well enough to take into account your own interests, and it is important for your own mental health that you don't violate your own core values. However, it's equally important that you honor the social values of other people. So when we consider what the social values are of other people, it's actually a combination of their core values and their preferences and their ways of doing things. So sometimes a social value is not necessarily a core value of a individual or their community, but rather it's the way that they like to do things. And the question is, does the way they like to do things conflict with your core value or not? In my experience at least, it tends to be pretty rare that somebody's social preference really violates my core value. more likely it violates kind of my standards. So maybe people eat something that I wouldn't normally eat. Well, it's not my core value what I eat, although for some people it could be. Rather, it's kind of my preference. And in this case, it's probably their preference, what they're eating. It's probably not a core value either. And so there's some compromise to be had in the middle there. Once again, if you're going to be working in a community, it's really important to understand people's social values. There's no end of anthropological literature where good scientists have tried to understand the social values of one community or another. So if you're going to work in a community, you need to understand the values of that community. And the two great ways to do it are by either reading the literature and finding good literature, or by getting to know somebody in the community and knowing them on a friendship basis where you can actually share with each other a lot of your values and learn what differences there might be, and in so knowing, be able to avoid dilemmas. Now, of course, we have two kinds of dilemmas that happen. We've already discussed the potential of a dilemma where something from somebody else's worldview clashes with your values, but the flip side of this is where something from our worldview clashes with somebody else's core values. And this is probably the more important half of what ethnobotanists have to deal with. We're usually able to plan and deal with the issues of our own core values, but it's when we don't plan appropriately and accidentally step on somebody else's values that we get into deep trouble. And so learning to avoid those kinds of issues is an important approach. Next, we have kind of an increasing series of levels of understanding. The first is your peer group. It's really important that you respect the opinions and beliefs of other people. Now, ethnobotany is really the study of differing opinions and beliefs about plants. So if you're studying people who have the same beliefs as you could have just written down your own thoughts and already have it down. What was the point? So much of the time we really are looking at people who have other beliefs. And in fact, it's interesting that even when people are studying within their own culture, oftentimes the reason they're studying it is because they have never actually learned their own culture. And so this kind of sets up some interesting situations. So because we're interested in knowing other people's opinions and beliefs, it doesn't mean that we have to accept their opinions and beliefs. So you do not have to agree with someone to be respectful of them. There's a fundamental difference here. And so acceptance of another person and acceptance of their beliefs and perspectives are two very different things. And as ethnobotanists, it's important that we be good documentaries, that we record information accurately as it's given to us, but it's not so important that we actually accept what people say as being how we're going to live our lives. Science, as it turns out, is not about finding single solutions. It is, however, about finding solutions. Science is about finding truth, ultimately. However, it turns out that we're always trying to hone in on what that truth is. And so we hope that we keep getting closer and closer. And the hope is that as we learn from people in a particular community, we're learning the solutions that they've figured out for how to survive in the world, and that we're documenting the ways in which they see the world and the ways in which that becomes functional for them. It's really important that when you work in a community that you don't mess things up for other people who might come along. It's not an infrequent situation for a researcher to go into a community, introduce themselves, and then the people in the community say, "Oh yeah, we know what scientists are all about. We had one here several years ago, and they came and they did this or that, and they violated this taboo or that one, and then they left, and we never heard from them again. But boy, did they stir up trouble while they were here." Well, it's really important that you not be that person who causes that problem, particularly if you're one of the first scientists to work in a community. You don't want to mess things up for people who come along later. The second issue the third issue that relates to peer group ethics is the issue of plagiarism. Plagiarism is basically stealing information from somebody else and taking personal credit for it. So if I hijack some knowledge from somebody else and stick my name on it, I have plagiarized. And this may be stealing an idea, it may be stealing words, it could be stealing almost anything, but plagiarism is a major ethical problem that relates to a peer group. The next level is colleagues. It's important that you be respectful of the opinions and beliefs of others. Once again, it's not critical that you believe their opinions and their beliefs, but it is important that you be respectful. For most of us, this particularly means being respectful of people who are older than us. This is a value that seems to run through just about every culture, the idea that elders know more than we do and that we should be respectful of them. And generally speaking, if you are respectful of elders in a sincere way, people will recognize that, and you tend to be accepted within a culture, because oftentimes it's the elders who are making the decisions. So by respecting them, you're respecting the people who deserve it within that culture. We need to recognize that there are moral differences. Now, the definition of morals seems to really be difficult to pin down, but you might look it up. It's an important word to consider and decide what it is you think morals are. But recognize that your colleagues may have some moral differences that you don't share, and therefore it may affect the way that you can interact with them. When you are conducting research with a teacher, and most of us who work in indigenous communities consider the people that we're learning from as being teachers in relationship to ourselves, it's really important that we use clear, informed consent. And what this means is that if we're asking questions about a particular plant, let's say, that in advance we tell people why we're asking these questions and what we're going to do with the information when we're done with it. And be sure and tell people who you are, what you're really doing. There's nothing worse than somebody who's sneaking around gathering information on the sly and planning on doing some crazy thing that they're going to call science. A critical step of science and the ethics of science is using informed consent. Next, it's important to communicate all the conditions and dispositions that you plan for the research results. If you're planning on publishing a scientific paper or writing a term paper for a class or whatever you're planning on doing, you need to tell people that that's what you have in mind. Because you never know when they might feel uncomfortable sharing something with you when they know that that's what you're planning on doing with it. Now, in my experience, most of the time, people are fine with something going into a scientific paper because they know good and well that most scientific papers are buried deeply in archives of oblivion, and no one will ever see that information. However, for some people this is an issue that they're concerned about, and so you need to be mindful of that. And then lastly, we need to be honest with both the teacher that we're working with and with fellow scientists. And what this means is that we need to try to make sure that as a scribe of traditional knowledge, that we do our very best to accurately portray not only what we see, but the way that people see themselves and the way that they want to be seen. One of my former teachers used as an example his photographs. When he was working with people, say in their gardens, he would bring along with him some nice t-shirts, oftentimes of his university, and when he asked to take a picture of somebody in their garden, rather than taking a picture of them wearing their beat-up garden shirt that probably looked like some rag, just like I would wear working in my garden, he would say, "I'd like to take a picture of you in your garden," and he would say, "Could I give you this nice shirt to wear for the photograph?" And he would give them a gift of a shirt, which was a nice thing to give in exchange for the photograph, and they could put it on, and they could feel really proud of themselves when they saw the photograph of themselves in their garden. So everybody won in that instance. And that's something that works in some cultures. Every culture is going to have something different that makes sense in it. That's a way of allowing people to see themselves the way they want to be seen. With our colleagues, we also need to be mindful of issues of intellectual property and cultural or real property. So intellectual property includes all of the information that can be published. This means that there needs to be consent that's given. It means that we need to distinguish between what is public knowledge and what is private knowledge and honor people's sense of privacy. So if a particular piece of knowledge is something that everybody in a community knows, then reporting that knowledge certainly has one set of implications. If it's something that's privately held by one or two individuals, particularly if it's the way they earn their living. Maybe it's secret knowledge or knowledge that's not supposed to be in the hands of other people, then we need to be really careful if we consider publishing that at all, and if so, in what form that takes. As I've already mentioned, plagiarism is the issue of not giving credit where credit is due, and so the ownership of knowledge and then the stealing of that knowledge is when we come into the issue of plagiarism. A lot of times we have to think about contractual responsibilities. If I receive a grant from some funding agency to go do research, I have a responsibility to do the research that I told the agency I would do. Otherwise, I should really return the funding that they provided. If I agree to publish a book and I get paid to do that, which is not exactly a common event, but it does happen sometimes, then I need to make sure that I follow through with the contractual obligations. And then lastly, we need to be aware of the fact that within our society, kind of a modern globalized society, that intellectual property is secured through means such as patents and copyrights and related kinds of legal approaches. However, this is not true in all cultures. And in fact, in many cultures, the way that intellectual property is secured is by keeping it secret. And so by breaking a secret that's shared with us, we are really violating the traditional intellectual property. Even though we may not be violating a patent or a copyright or something like that, we need to recognize that other people have their equivalents of those kind of modern categories of intellectual property management. Secondly, then, we have the issues of cultural or real property. And these wouldn't seem to be ethical dilemmas, but you have to think about them a little bit carefully and realize that, especially when you step into economies that are not cash-based economies, cultural property can be a little bit different than it is in our own, and therefore it's a little bit dicey. So if we collect artifacts from in a community or specimens, these really shouldn't be bought and sold out there, particularly if somebody gave you something as a personal gift. We have lots of museums that are appropriate places for these to be deposited, or even better yet, getting culturally important artifacts back into the hands of the members of the culture. It's not infrequent for cultures to have reciprocal trade kinds of situations where people will give you something as a gift, you give them something as a gift, and down the line you're able to give back to somebody else the gift that's a part of their culture that you got from somebody. Probably in the long run, this is far better than having large museum warehouses full of gifts that are valuable objects to one culture or another, but are now isolated from the members of that culture. As scientists, we make lots of different kinds of field collections. These include photographs, notes, plant specimens, all kinds of things, and it could be artifacts as well. And it's really important that we have permission and that we are accurate in how we report these. There are many photographs and tape recordings and plant specimens and so forth that reside in scientific repositories that just have bad information recorded with them, or that it's fairly clear there was not consent of the people of the community to actually collect those things. They were just basically stolen. And this is particularly true of photographs. It's very important that we have approval, and to take photographs, people specifically grant their permission, and that we make sure that people know what we're going to do with the photograph and where it will reside. It's also usually important that copies of photographs be given to people because in many situations this is the only way people will get photographs of themselves. One of the main categories of leadership that ethnobotanists tend to work with is the leaders of traditional governments. This may be chiefly level leaders, or it may be elected community leaders, it may be religious leaders in a community. But we deal with traditional governments quite a lot because most of the cultures that we're interested in working with, particularly people that are living in biodiverse regions of the world, actually depend more upon the traditional government than they do upon national or other kinds of modern governments. However, there's sometimes conflicts that occur and disagreements that can occur. And it's really important that you actually follow the rules and policies of a local government unless they violate your core values. And you have to keep that in mind. You know, your preferences from your culture may appear to be in direct conflict with the beliefs and strategies of local leaders, but that doesn't make the local leaders wrong. And when you're in somebody else's land, you need to follow what their government's rules are. So they may have different political strategies, they may have different religions, may have different opinions of culture and what biodiversity is all about. They may not think that conservation is important, or they may see conservation as being something different than you do. Whatever the case is, we're in a position where we need to honor their beliefs. In some cases, ethnobotanists find themselves in a situation between a national government and traditional governments. And so this is where a judgment call comes to bear. So the local governments may actually be fighting with their own national government. And so some ethnobotanists have chosen to stand with the traditional governments and try to help them, and basically being opposed to the national government. Others have decided to stand with the national government and oppose the local government. And many other people have just tried to stay out of the way and not get involved. But whatever the case is, all three of those were ethical decisions. They were not based upon scientific criteria per se, but they were based upon an ethical decision based upon your values. It's really important that we respect and honor the recommendations of local authorities. However, as I've said before, it's not critical that you actually believe and accept their opinions and recommendations. You just need to be able to honor them. Lastly, we have the national government level. If you're going to work in a particular country, it's important that you comply with the regulations of that country. If for some reason you think a country has some laws that you just cannot abide by, you probably shouldn't be working there. It's that simple. You know, if you can't deal with that, then just, you know, you're in the wrong business. When people ask for something, one of the kind of standards that most ethnobotanists follow is that you should provide more than is requested. So if you're requested to provide some paperwork, if you're requested to provide some assistance with some local project, whatever it is, that you provide more than is generally requested. And it's important to invest in good working relationships for the future, not only for your own work, but for that of others, because there will be other people who come along. And it's important to not stab a government official in the back. And sometimes it's really easy to get into this situation where, you know, you've promised some government official that you will help out with something, and this official has helped you get a permit to do research, and then you realize that, wow, you know, I probably shouldn't be working with that person. I'm going to change the whole path of what I'm doing. And it's really important that you don't stab somebody in the back. These things can come back to haunt you in ways that you might not expect. When you work with local cultures, there's several approaches that are important to follow in order to make sure that you are functional and that you are being ethically responsible within a community. The first of these is to try to learn traditions of a community in advance. Don't try and learn on the fly or learn by making mistakes. This is not a very wise strategy. Probably the most important of these is to simply be respectful of people. If you are respectful and are not egotistic within your approach, you will probably be well accepted within a local culture. The second is to be an advocate for people. It varies around the world as to what a local culture needs an advocate for, and it's important that you choose to be an advocate in the way that they want you to be an advocate, not in the way that you want to be an advocate. But it could be advocating land rights. Oftentimes ethnobotanists are involved in helping to either demarcate land that's of traditional value, or recognizing that people use land and resources and therefore have a right to it. Lots of issues that relate to that. Conservation, both of biological and cultural diversity. This could be conservation of language diversity. Lots of different conservation issues come up. It could be simply encouragement. In every society there's a number of people who are eager to preserve their culture, to see it grow and thrive, and oftentimes the kind of work that Ethnobotanists does functions as an encouragement for them. And that's an important issue, and it's an important ethical responsibility. And then finally, as an advocate, it's important to promote financial stability. And although most of us as ethnobotanists are not doing the work that we do in order to become wealthy, in fact, I don't know of any wealthy ethnobotanists, it is important that we recognize that people who live in the communities we're working in need to have financial stability, and that it helps to stabilize their cultures, it helps to stabilize them as individuals, and it helps them to feel better and live their lives and be happy. And so by helping to create some levels of financial stability as we see the opportunity, this really is an ethical responsibility that we should live up to. We have a set of sponsor institutions and organizations that we need to honor and that we have an ethical responsibility to. And this is done in three pretty straightforward ways. The first is to represent yourself in a good way. And we all have a pretty good sense of what is good and what is bad behavior. And so when you are working for an institution, whether it be a university or a government agency or some nonprofit organization or whatever it is, it's important that you be on good behavior while you're representing them. The second is that you acknowledge sources of funding and sponsorship, that people know who you work for, that you're not sneaking around. And third, that you use funding that's provided for the purposes for which it was provided. All of these are ethical approaches. Within a consideration of ethics, we kind of boil things down to a set of core values that we can say these are really the core values of ethnobotanists as scientists. And hopefully these are also core values of most of you. The first of these is referred to as Bennett's Rule. Dr. Brad Bennett at Florida International University has often stated that the key to being a successful ethnobotanical research, and therefore being a successful and ethical researcher, is simply using courtesy and common sense. And that by applying these, you will be able to be successful as a field researcher. So this involves doing things that are obvious. If there's something that needs to be done, you should do it. It involves avoiding selfish kinds of actions. If you're doing something, it's very clear that this is intended to solely benefit you. It's probably very questionable as to why you're doing it. And it's unlikely that this is following the idea of courtesy and common sense. Second is to be honest. Really do what is clearly obvious. Don't lie to people. Don't be deceptive. Don't tell white lies, black lies, whatever kind of lies. Just be honest. Be straightforward. People can tell when you're being a straight shooter with them and when you're trying to be deceptive. So just be honest. And then thirdly is be generous. Treat other people the way that you would want to be treated, or even better. And people are really good at recognizing that you are generous, and in most cases people will not take advantage of this, and in fact they'll celebrate the fact that you're a generous individual, and they will also be generous with you. Being generous never fails to have a reward for you. You shouldn't obviously be generous in order to get rewarded, but what goes around comes around, and this is where it pays off. Next, we have a series of ethical dilemmas that you should review. Look over the ethical dilemmas. They're in a handout, and think about how you would deal with each one of these. Consider how you would respond to each based upon the core values that you have, the ethics of your peer group, your colleagues, leadership of a community or different levels of a government, how the sponsorship ethics would come into play, and what local cultural values are coming to bear. And think about each one and respond as you feel is appropriate. Remember, on each of these dilemmas, there's not really a correct answer that's a universal answer. However, for each and every one of them, there really is a correct answer for you. And in fact, because many of us share a common cultural heritage and common set of cultural values, for many of these, there actually will be a common correct answer that we will share. and this simply reflects that we have a common cultural background.
As we've seen, there's a lot to think about when it comes to the issue of ethics. This is particularly true of ethnobotanists because we interact so much with other people, people who have different value systems, different ways of looking at the world, and different understandings of what plants are and what they mean. And so this places a lot of pressure on us in the kind of work that we do. And I hope you'll think about these things when you consider the roles of plants in human society.